I do want to take a few minutes to give you a bit of an overview of who TalentMap is, as well as tell you a little bit about some of the learnings I was able to pick up at a recent conference I attended. So I'll spend a few minutes on that, and then we'll hand it over to Helen. Let Helen walk through succession planning and some insights there, and then wrap up with some questions. So a little bit of background around TalentMap. We've been in this business of employee engagement for over 12 years now. We've run thousands of surveys, had the opportunity to work with a whole range of organizations, anything from a small 30 or 40 person organizations to large 100,000 employee organizations. So that's given us some real insight into what some of the challenges and issues are from management purposes, as well as from an employee engagement focus. Just a little bit of snapshot. We work with a range of clients. We also do some of Canada's best employer programs. So we've been successful in sharing a lot of what we've learned to organizations, and this is what we hope to do today in terms of the webinar. A little bit about what TalentMap does. A big focus is on employee engagement, and employee engagement is really an important area because we've been able to see, both the research we've done as well as other organizations, a very strong link to highly engaged employees and better business performance. It could be better safety records, lower turnover, higher productivity, higher financial performance, even better health outcomes for the employees. So there's a very strong linkage, and that's why engagement has really continued to be an important aspect within any organization. And what we try to do is help organizations measure and manage that engagement. Probably one of the best definitions for engagement, I often say, is how do you define it? Often what we define it as just discretionary effort. The difference between the minimum an employee is willing to put out to maintain his or her job and keep the work to the maximum that they could put out if they're firing on all cylinders. And that's really what we're trying to do with organizations, is understand and measure where do they stack up on this continuum. And as an organization, when we measure engagement, we measure around a range of dimensions, anything from leadership to teamwork to innovation, all focused on trying to understand engagement. So that's a little bit about TalentMap. Now let's turn to what we've learned recently. I have the opportunity to attend conferences on occasion, and I'm a member of Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology. And that organization's mission is really to enhance the well-being of organizations and employees within those organizations by promoting the science and practice of psychology and psychology measurement within organizations. It's an important organization. I often talk about it in our presentations because it affects the way we apply our work. The work we do is driven very much on not just what employees and what organizations want to measure, but very much by the science that we're learning around human behavior. And so much of what we learn and apply comes out of the research that's done by psychologists, both in the academic as well as practitioner fields. I was lucky enough to be in Honolulu just recently, just last week actually, and covered off a number of different items. This just gives you a snapshot of some of the types of conference topics that are discussed at things like SIOP. Leader personality to employee engagement. So looking at different leadership styles and how that affects employee engagement. So the second session there was around identified employee surveys, so linking employee surveys back to the individual, ethical issues around that, and appropriate actions to employee workplace and job performance and around work engagement. A lot of these are academic presentations around research that's being done, but just to give you a sense of the type of work that's being looked at around engagement out there. Now, I want to just touch on a couple of interesting pieces that I picked up at the conference. One was around linking organizational behavior to molecular genetics. There was an interesting couple of sessions around looking at people's dopamine levels, serotonin levels, oxytocin levels, and organizational performance. And they're doing this right now in laboratories and looking at, for example, cortisol levels, which is a representative of the level of stress that an employee might have or an individual might have, and looking at actually measuring their DNA and how they would respond to certain types of questions in a laboratory environment about their workplace and about performance. So some very interesting studies taking engagement and measurement beyond just the survey and looking at about how it affects our body through pure measurement around certain levels of genetics. Also attended an interesting session on neuroscience and using EEG studies on organizational behavior topics. So there's an organizational group that has certain headsets. These headsets are now very cost effective. They can put it on individuals, have them complete assessments and tests, and map out the level of brain activity and how they respond to certain questions and certain texts in the survey. So again, just to give you some indication of the level of work and science that's going into these types of assessments and types of surveys that are done at SIOP. One of the important topics that came up was around who owns employee engagement and some interesting trends around what we're seeing there. One was around the focus of not just looking at engagement as all the responsibility of the management or the organization, but it should also be responsible for the individual. There was things talked about creating individual engagement reports or indexes. So instead of getting an overall engagement score, the employee within the organization would get his or her individual report. So an interesting approach or interesting prospect, as opposed to looking at organizational engagement, looking at individual engagement. Another example of that growing focus on the individual about taking responsibility for engagement was around some of the tools and exercises I learned about the concept around job crafting. Job crafting is a little bit different than job redesign in that employees are very actively involved in redesigning their work, and this concept of job crafting, which was talked about and presented on, was very interesting. And I'll be talking about job crafting later on in future webinars. So the summary of learning that I picked up at SIOP I thought was quite interesting in that there's really a growing range of research on engagement. Things to look at, we're seeing links to neuroscience and genetics that I talked about, measurement around team engagement versus just organizational engagement, measurement around what is management engagement, is it different from employee engagement? These are some of the topics that are talked about and growing. The other learning I picked up was that engagement is not going away. Organizations are building infrastructures around measurement, linking engagement to their balanced scorecard. So there's quite a bit of work over the last 10 or 15 years that are really embedding the process into engagement. But there is some changes in that engagement should be a two-way street. So looking at not just being a management responsibility, but being also the onus on the employee to start to engage themselves, and some tools around there. And then the last thing is really around action planning. Action planning was talked about in some of these sessions and continues to be a real challenge. And that real challenge is, what do you do when you get the survey results? What do you do when you find that you have some challenges within your workplace? And that's where I want to introduce Helen today, because Helen has an interesting approach, an interesting set of tools that helps address a particular issue in the workplace, which is succession planning. It's all great to have an engaged workplace, but if a lot of these engaged employees are retiring or leaving, what can you do to help manage that process? Because we know that baby boomers are starting to leave and starting to move on. So with that, I'm going to stop on the learnings on SIOP, I want to turn it over to Helen. As I mentioned, Helen comes from a very strong background on consulting, having spent a number of years at McKinsey, consulting to some of the world's largest organizations and most successful organizations. And now, over the last number of years, has been running her own organization, and that organization has been focusing on helping organizations around CEO transition and, in particular, succession planning. So I'd like to turn it over now to Helen and let Helen walk through a little bit about what she's learned on the succession planning side. Helen?
Thanks, Sean. It's a real pleasure to be with Sean and TalentMap today and to be able to sort of dialogue with all of you. The work I do, succession planning is certainly part of it, but what I hope I'll be able to communicate to you today that a good, thorough leadership talent review process does so much more than that. And it's scalable from the biggest of companies to the smallest of companies. But it's really a process that's focused on really the top of the house, the top 10 or 20 leaders in an organization, and really supporting their development, assessment of them, and also succession all happens together. So I want to talk about the leadership talent review process. You may have heard of this, you know, this famous session C at GE, when you see it in the grandeur of the scale of a GE organization. But even small and medium-sized companies can apply these same principles. So it serves multiple purposes, and it can be applied in many ways. But I want to share with you today the basic principles of it. What are some barriers that get in the way to making them effective, and what are some of the real keys to make a really good leadership talent review process work in an organization? So essentially, a leadership talent review process does two things. It looks at each individual being reviewed. So you might look at 20 executives, and you want to assess their performance in current role, their potential for future roles, and so on, as you can see. And it also looks at a broader organizational perspective, looking at the talent strengths overall and planning for key succession roles. If you try to do just succession planning alone, it won't be as successful as when it stands on and leverages the deeper dive look at each individual. So that's kind of in a nutshell what it looks like. So let's go on to what its benefits should be. A well-done, high-impact leadership talent review should have impact at 3 levels. One level is the individual being reviewed, so they receive feedback coming out of this process, or they should. They should have a much clearer understanding of where they stand. They should get great, rich feedback on their strengths and weaknesses. And they should have a clear dialogue with their leader about, it should facilitate that dialogue, and where's my career going in this place? And Sean, I'm sure you often find in your engagement surveys that people often say, I don't get enough career development, enough career planning, enough feedback. And the leadership talent review process for the most senior people can really help address that.
Yeah, Helen, that's a good point. Often, that's in fact when we look at the key drivers, when you do a key driver analysis of our survey results as to what are the biggest things that link to engagement, professional growth and leadership development, career development actually comes out in #1 as the most important driver that links or drives better engagement for both managers as well as employees.
Right. So, and it's tough for an individual manager to do that effectively with their direct report all by themselves. The fundamental premise of leadership talent review is that the executive team come together, they sit at the table for a significant amount of time talking about these people being reviewed. Okay, so that's the fundamental kind of what talent review looks like, right? Executive team sitting around in a conference room talking about the people just below them. So the individuals being reviewed get things. The individual who's doing the review, so the leader who comes in to talk with his executive team about the 4, 5, 6 people directly underneath her, really gains from a well-done process as well, because they're finding that they're more able to put in action plans into place to help them strengthen their team. They gain confidence in their assessments so they can give better development and career advice. And so they're more able to hold those kind of rich feedback discussions with each of their people. So their talent mindset, their talent skills are strengthened by doing this process collectively with their executive team. And then the organization as a whole gains a tremendous amount. You're more able to optimize the development, move high potential people around from one silo, one area to another. Certainly you find that low performers in the roles being discussed are moved on more quickly and effectively. And here, of course, is where the succession planning occurs, right? So as an executive team, you're building options and scenarios for succession for the key leadership roles. So a good leadership talent review process sort of rings the bell on multiple dimensions. So what holds us back? Some of you may not have any leadership talent review in place in your organization today, but those of you who do and may find, I often get HR executives who call me and say, we've done this for many years. We use a performance potential grid. We have these meetings with executive teams, but I don't feel like we're getting the power out of it that we should. Here are some of the common pitfalls that if you have some sort of a talent review in place, you may be experiencing. One is you try to talk about too many people all at once and you're too rushed. So it's not uncommon for me to hear about, oh, we talk about 200 people in a 4-hour meeting. Well, by definition, you're not able to go very deep on anyone. So trying to talk about too many people all at once with a blizzard of kind of too much scale, not enough depth. Another is the leaders come into the discussions, come around the table, and it's a polite presentation, right? So the head of marketing says, here's my review of my people, and he might get a polite question or two, and he sits down, and then the head of operations stand up and says, that's not what good leadership talent review is about. What you need is honesty, candor, collective problem solving. They shouldn't be polite presentations, nor should they be impolite, but they should be rich discussions among the executive team. I often prep leaders going into these discussions to say, you're going to bring in an opening draft of your point of view on each person, but if you haven't walked out at the end of the day with substantial new insights about your people and maybe even a different and clearer action plan than you thought, we've just wasted everybody's time. So it's about harnessing the collective wisdom of the executive team, not just polite presentations. Nor is it about horse trading. If any of you have been in a calibration meeting, and you have names on a performance potential grid, and one leader is defending his person, and everybody's just defending their own people, that's not what we want either. Another thing that gets in the way is when leaders write up their assessments of people and think about them, they're so used to writing performance evaluations that go to the individual that they're stuck in that old habit of saying it politely, not really saying the bad stuff, everybody's great, everybody's lovely, and that gets in the way. So in the leadership talent review work we do, we say, no, we're going to write about and talk about each of the leaders we're assessing, not to ever show that document to the individual, but for us as a leadership team to get clear about our thinking on people. Later, we'll write a different version of feedback, as you'll see, to go to the individual. So that gets in the people base. It's also not helpful if it's just names on charts. You just have 200 names up on a performance potential grid. That doesn't get you very far, and I'll show you some alternatives to that. Of course, the top leaders need to kind of get this. If this is going to be your senior executive team, the CEO has to believe that this is important, and I'll show you some ideas to break through that, where not everybody around the executive team needs to be a believer, but the CEO does, and a handful of champions do. And then finally, the unwillingness to differentiate. This was one of the huge findings of the work I did on the War for Talent and the book that we wrote from that what really makes a difference in talent academies, places, organizations are great at this, is that senior leaders need to get comfortable with assessing people and really talking about their strengths and their weaknesses, about who are our top A-star performers and who are weak, and being more and more comfortable making the tough calls to differentiate between those people who have high potential, those people who don't, those who are currently performing the roles very well, and those who are not. And without that willingness, you don't get very far. It's sort of a philosophical mindset that leaders bring into it that we can get leaders past. So if you've got a talent review process, you may be experiencing some of these barriers. So how do we break through that? Two things. The next page doesn't want to go into much depth, but it basically says, yes, you need a process, you need some tools, you need the basic, makings of good talent review structures and processes, but they are not the magic. But there are basic requirements. So let me talk a tiny bit about each of these, and the real magic is coming on the next page. So you do need some sort of a document that writes up a talent profile that says, here's the individual being discussed. Many companies do it with a single page. I like to build this up and say we need to know something about their career history. We need to understand what their current results are and their, how are they delivering the results. We need something about their leadership competencies, and then typically a kind of a summary and action plan. But it's some sort of a document or a tool that represents the thinking on the person on paper. Then two meetings, two separate meetings. One's a deep dive, again, the executive team around the table, deep dive to talk about each individual. And then 3 or 4 weeks later, we bring them back again, and we have a shorter meeting, but it's a roll-up where we can really look at the big picture. And this is where we can use tools like a color-coded org chart and succession charts. And now that we've all agreed and we've gone deep on the individuals, now in the big picture, we can stand back and say, okay, what does this tell us about the organization overall? And we can really seriously think about scenarios for succession replacement in senior roles. The final step, the good work and thinking that's happened behind closed doors in the boardroom with the executive team needs to go down, get delivered and communicated and discussed with the individual that's been reviewed. So my preference is for literally an unstructured feedback memo. Get the leader to talk in prose to their individual, written and then discussion about their strengths, their weaknesses, their performance, and their future potential. So these tools aren't magic. These are the ones that my firm, Insight Talent Advisors, uses in our client situations. It doesn't have to look just like that, but you need a basic set of tools and process that kind of get it going. But I know lots of companies that have tools like this, but there's no magic. They don't get the benefits I described before. They go through the motions. They put in place the tools. They're using a performance potential grid. They're doing all these things, but really the richness isn't there. The insight isn't coming from it. So last page, what's the real magic that gets you from the basic tools and the barriers to a really great discussion about talent? So this is where I want to spend the time because it's the less visible part, and it's the part that really makes the difference. So high touch. High touch is sort of the theme for this. Here's my advice how to have a great talent review process or to reinvigorate one if you have one in place today. My first advice is start small. Don't go into this and say we're going to cover 200 people or big numbers. The senior leaders need to experience this, know what it's like, feel success, know what it takes before you go any farther. So I would typically say, it's 20 leaders. It's the people who report to your executive team. Start there. Or even better, you start with the CEO to review her top team of people, direct reports to the CEO, and then they review their direct reports. Just stop there for a year or two. Get the success of what that feels like. Have those people experience. I've worked with plenty of CEOs and executives who kind of have this talent review process sort of foisted upon them one way or the other. Somebody comes along and says they should do this, so they do this. And they kind of grumble a little bit maybe or are skeptical. But once they've experienced it and they have the experience of what it's like to go deep in the discussion on each person and come out with new insights, clear action plans, they get it. And their eyes sort of light up and they say, wow, that was time well spent. I want my people to go through that. So you got to get leaders to experience it in small scale first before you go any farther. And make sure you do the top 5 people and the top 20 people really, really well. Much more important than doing 50 people not so well. The second advice is the executive team needs to spend time on this. You just can't talk about 20 people in half a day. It just doesn't happen. My rule of thumb is we talk about each person for 45 minutes. It's an in-depth conversation, well prepared, well structured, a point of view coming in that the team reacts to. So the executive team has to commit to spend the time. If you're going to review 20 people, it's going to take them 2 whole days or 10 people in a day. When I work one-on-one with CEOs to review their top 5 people, we're in a discussion for 5 hours. It's a real deep discussion where you're pulling out the insights from the head out of the minds of the CEO and the other executives about these people. It takes time to process that. so the executive team has to spend the time on it. The next thing is really setting the stage for candor, exploration. I call it collective problem solving. When I prepare executives to participate in these reviews, I say, look, you're going to do your best thinking and preparation going in so you can get the ball started talking about your people. But you should find that your colleagues contribute all kinds of rich insights about your people that they know as well. You're going to hear the multiple perspectives. You're going to get to talk through your thinking about people. You talk through, things you're not sure of about your people, and engage in collective problem solving. And I think I mentioned earlier, I say to people that, if you walk out of this 2-day meeting with no new insights about your people, we've totally wasted our time. And done well, people walk out and say, wow, that was really good use of executive time, and we got places that we didn't get, that I wasn't at before I walked in the room. So you help them get their mindset ready for, this is an experience of exploration and thinking together, as opposed to polite presentations going on. And then I recommend expert facilitation. If you put an executive team in the room to talk to the people, they're not going to quite get there. So the consultants on my team that I put into these situations, we know how to facilitate the dialogue, draw out multiple insights, and go deep on key issues. So, we will have seen the preparation in advance, thought it through, and really facilitate that dialogue. Now, HR executives, I'm sure a number of you on the phone are HR managers. You can learn to do this too. But it's not a passive facilitation. It's an active facilitation where we draw out the insights, facilitate the dialogue, make sure that those 45 minutes are spent going deep on key issues, and being provocative in our questions. When we do this with our clients, we are kind of the third party, people brought in to do this, and third party status helps because we can ask the tough questions that sometimes people around the room may be reluctant to ask. And we can provide counsel on things. So having a third party who's not in any way politically involved in this team can come in and ask the tough questions and really bring out the insights that may be difficult otherwise. The other thing is one-on-one support for the executives. This is hard work for the executive who's going to review 4 or 5 people to go in, to be prepared to go into this event, and to come out of this event with a great feedback to deliver to the individuals. Don't expect leaders to do this well by themselves. We just can't put tools in their hands and say, go do it. We need to provide a significant amount of one-on-one support to get each executive ready into the session and ready to provide good feedback. And the last point, the feedback that goes to the individual should be rich and meaningful. And to do that well, I highly recommend the written feedback is in prose. It's not, a scorecard on some leadership competencies, and by the way, here you are on a performance potential grid. We don't even share that with the individuals. We get the leader to write a memo to the person, a page and a half, that summarizes the point of view about their performance, their potential, their career going forward. What are the 2 or 3 things they should focus on for their development in the next year or 2? And these things are typically stories. So, you can't afford to do that for 500 people in the organization, but you can afford to take that high-touch care for the top 5, the top 20. The biggest client that we work goes to 120, but that's massive. Most of our clients do it for the top 20 or 30 or 40 people in their organizations, and they invest the time to do it well. So there's what I wanted to share with you in terms of what makes a really great leadership talent review, what unlocks the magic to go from a kind of one that goes through the motions but doesn't get the impact to one that really has the kind of impact it should have. So let me turn it back to Sean for some Q&A time from all of you and see where we go.
Sure. Thank you very much, Helen. That was really good. It was a good overview of succession process. I know a lot of HR professionals are struggling with succession planning and what's working and what isn't working. I guess a question that has come in is really around how long would this typically take from start to finish, or what What's the process look like? Is this something that's ongoing? Is it done over a 1 month, 2 month period of time? Sort of what tell us a little bit around timing.
So it is a process that we think companies should go through once a year. It's part of your annual process, just like the executive team, does work on strategy and does work on, business performance review. The executive team should come together once a year to work on the talent. And so we do recommend it as being kind of a formal once a year process that they go through. The process itself, it takes about 2 months beginning to end. So executives have to prepare their talent profiles in advance. Typically that takes them 3 or 4 weeks. They come into a deep dive meeting. Coming out of that, it takes 2 or 3 weeks to get those revised and go into a big picture meeting, and then another few weeks for them to get organized to write their memos. That's a lot of elapsed time because these are busy people and they're not going to drop everything and do it tomorrow morning. So we give them 3 or 4 weeks to write their talent profiles and work with our consultants to get that in good shape, and 3 or 4 weeks to write their talent their review letters. So elapsed time, 2.5 months, just to give executives time to get their work done.
Good. So somewhere around the 2 to 2.5 month time frame, but it's something that should be done on an annual basis because it's something that should look like just as you look at all your other processes like performance management. You mentioned earlier on around obstacles or the senior leaders sometimes don't get it. Can you expand a little bit about that? So when you say they don't get it, what are some of the things that they don't grasp? So they don't feel it's worth the investment in time? Is that part of they don't think it's going to benefit them, or is it they just don't understand the process? When you talk about some of the managers that don't get it, what is it that they don't get, I guess, in a way?
So you ask any CEO or executive, is talent important? Yes. Is developing our people important? Yes. I mean, they all believe that, but they don't know what it takes to do it well, and they've never experienced it done really well, so experience the value that comes out of it. And because they haven't experienced that value, then they can't understand how we could spend this kind of time on it. They've never seen it, what good looks like. Right? So my experience with the vast majority of executives is that once they've experienced what good looks like, they get it. And what they get is that there's valuable time spent executives talking with each other in the room about talent. They realize why that generates value. They understand what a really robust assessment looks like, the insights of it, the thinking behind it. They understand what a clear action plan looks like. So they do their own work. They try to get their thinking as far as they can, and then they see the depth and quality of the thinking they get at the end of this process, and they say, okay, I now understand what really good, insightful, robust assessment and action plan looks like, and I kind of understand why those, a full day of executive time is worth it to get there, why we do that.
Good, okay. So that's interesting. So the fact that they don't know what they don't know, in some cases, is something that maybe why they might be objecting to heading down a path like this, because from what you've seen or from what you've shown here, it looks like a really valuable process. One of the things that you did touch on is the number of sort of documents that you pull together. You'll expect the managers to go and to get feedback from maybe their peers around their talent or the people that they report to. You looked at competencies and skills and a number of different sort of approaches. How do you manage all of these things? How do you sort of coordinate them all? Because it's fine if you're doing 5 or 10 people, but if you're into 20 or 30 people, I suspect that would be a bit of a challenge to be able to manage and coordinate all these documents and archives of information around key people. And especially when you're doing them year over year, you probably want to keep an ongoing record of this type of activity.
Right, lots of ways you could do it. By the way, I would not recommend early on in your work on this or with any kind of small to mid-sized company, I would not recommend jumping to the software solutions that are designed for succession planning because they get you very locked into certain tools which may not be the ones you want, and the technology overwhelms you. I would not recommend that. You develop the forms that work for you. It could be a 1-pager or a 4-pager. There's zillions of ways you can do it. There's zillions of options for this. Design what works for you. Make it custom tailored to your organization, right? And work with it in a flexible format. We tend to use Excel forms, right? They're very flexible. We can totally redesign them. It's very flexible. Once you got your form developed, then the management of these things, certainly, companies do this, just basic paper, an email transfer, and the HR person who facilitates this sort of has, the old-fashioned binder or, on their hard drive, files of all these documents. But it is difficult and cumbersome to keep doing that. When we work with clients, because we're outside consultants and we're collaborating with the executives to get their material ready, we both have to be able to see and work on the same documents. My firm, Insight Talent Advisors, has a very simple portal that's incredibly easy to use that really stores the individual documents for each of our clients. So it's taking a basic Excel and PowerPoint documents, as you would know them and work on them, and just have a storage place for them that has very controlled access mechanisms. So, for instance, the HR person in the organization could access everybody's files, but a particular leader could only access the files for his people. So very highly controlled, but it's really just a central, if any of you have worked with the SharePoint system, if you've worked with Google Docs or SharePoint, you kind of understand the concept. It's like being able to access a public folder, but it's done through the Internet, and we control the access for who goes there. So, if you're doing it without consulting help, you just need, a good mechanism to store the electronic versions of things and have them coming in. But the portal that we use sort of facilitates all of that in a very simple way. It's very easy to get running.
So it sounds like the real important part is the content and working through the issues, and if technology can enable that, great, but it sounds like there's a lot of off-the-shelf desktop tools that people can use, Excel, Word, all to organize all of this, and it's really the crux of it is the discussion, the deep dive into the issues, and not so much sort of coordinating stuff on a database or something like that. So that's good.
You want to keep the technology simple. I mean, technology is not just computer technology, but the forms and the tools. Keep them as simple as you can. Keep the overhead of the organization of it simple and just get on with it, so you're getting them and having great discussions. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, this has been fantastic, Helen. I really appreciate your insight into this concept, because succession planning continues to be, and I think will continue to grow as a concern and issue for organizations, and particularly for HR professionals as they grapple with how to wrap their head or arms around this type of approach. Helen, I put your name up here, so it's okay if anyone contacts you. They can. The easiest way to get you, I think, is Helen at insight-ta.com.
That's right.
Okay, perfect. Good. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to just wrap up on this webinar here today. I appreciate everyone's time and attendance. TalentMap will be presenting at a couple of upcoming events. We're at in Guelph in mid-June at the HRPA dinner, talking about moving the needle on engagement. And our next webinar is at the end of June, where we'll be talking a little bit about job crafting and some of the issues and challenges around getting individuals to take ownership for engagement. And of course, throughout the summer and fall, we're participating in a number of other events around employee engagement, wrapping up in later on in the fall with Canada's Top 100 that we're actively involved with. And I strongly encourage you to continue to stay in touch with us. If you haven't, I encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter. We put it out about once a month, and in the newsletter we try to include value-added tips, tools, tactics, things that could hopefully help you in your role as a HR professional understand and drive engagement, as well as the follow-on outcomes around improving engagement, like succession planning, leadership development, and so on. So with that, we're going to wrap up. It sounds like we've covered off the questions, and I again appreciate everyone. There'll be a recording of this stored on our website in a few days, and we'll wrap up there. Thank you.
To contact us, or to learn more, just Google TalentMap, or simply click on the link below.